Chapter 4 War with the Apaches. Returning home from the Flathead in the late fall of the year, I showed little interest in a return to the little teachers' college where I had been utterly bored. There was nothing to do around the pueblo. For excitement, I accepted a sort of questionable warrant from the local justice of the peace to be the game warden for the surrounding area. I questioned at the time if a J.P., a smallish minion of the judiciary, had the authority to make anyone a game warden, but at any rate, armed with a handwritten authority, I buckled on the old Parker 45 auto and commenced to stalk local game violators. I had, it must be admitted, turned my coat. Heretofore, the Hammers and myself might very well have been the biggest deer poachers in the neighborhood. I intended to be pretty selective about who I nailed as a game violator. We lived about 20 miles from what was then a sizable town of 20,000. The jazzbos from this metropolis made a practice of running down in our ballywhack and shooting our game. It was my firm intention to deal with these scallywags. In no time at all, I had picked up 4 of these utter rascals. I sat up on the hood of their old Hupmobile and guided them into the offices of the Justice of the Peace who had been so brash as to make me his deputy. This was just what he had anticipated. He fined each individual $25 in costs, the cost being $17.50 each. They had been trespassing on Fred McDowell, who indeed was never told of this dastardly invasion of his horse pasture, while the J.P. and myself split the take. He gave me $10 and kept the remainder. I would speculate, if the records were thoroughly combed, that the $100 he collected plus whatever part of the costs were supposed to occur to the county hasn't gotten there to this day. The old J.P., his name was Dr. Albert Hughes. He got the title of doctor from the days when he toured the country in a covered wagon drawn by a single horse and hawked Dr. J.D. Adams' elixir of youth. This concoction, he confidentially informed me, was mostly alcohol and made the recipient feel mighty good. At any rate, Doc settled in my small pueblo and wrangled the job of local justice of the peace. He and I had a good thing going, as I was meticulous to see that the only culprits brought before the bar of justice were what we referred to as foreigners. There was some deer poaching going on north of town, and as anyone who lived as far as 4 to 5 miles outside the territorial limits of the township were considered outsiders, I commenced to work there. I had a suspect named Abner Zettner, and I went into his barn one night after the sun had set, and there found a carcass of a big white-tailed doe. The next day, about 3 in the afternoon, when this hombre climbed the fence out of the neighbor's farm, his old double-barrel Montgomery Ward 12-gauge over his shoulder, I jumped him out. "Let me see that gun," I told him. "I reckon you've got it loaded with buckshot." The game seasons were all closed, and it would be prima facie evidence that he was hunting deer if the chambers held buckshot loads. He refused. I hauled out the old Parker 45 and stuck it under his nose. "Give me that shotgun, you son of a bitch, or I'll put a bullet right between your eyes," I informed him. He handed over the smoothbore. I broke it open. One handed the spilled out the shells. The rounds held number 6 shot. I was considerably nonplussed. "I'll tell you," I handed his gun back to him, throwing the cartridge on the ground, and I said to him, I know goddamn you that you're a deer poacher. Maybe I didn't hang it on you this time, but just be goddamn sure I'll get you." He ran over to the county seat and had a warrant sworn out for me for pointing a 6-shooter at him. It wasn't a 6-shooter, even if he told it that way, and the sheriff came over and served a warrant on me. Doc Hughes went to bat for me. He went over to the county attorney, and they had quite a powwow. My J.P. assured him that this Bird Zettner had a bad reputation in the neighborhood, was suspected of poaching deer the year round, and that he had personally directed that I keep an eye on him. The county attorney, with all the issuance of that day and time, simply tore up the complaint. I'm sure Abner Zettner is still probably waiting for a call from the county seat to come over and offer evidence. Before I finally got into one of these situations where I'd be forced to kill someone, my old man wrote to Aldo Leopold, very probably the country's leading game conservationist and a ranking authority in America's forests, and asked Leopold, who was an old friend, to see if he could get the Askins Jr. into the U.S. Forest Service. It was not enough that I could return to the Flathead the coming summer. The old man hoped for something that would be year-long, and preferably as deeply removed as Leopold could find. In no time at all, there came a letter from the Forest Service at Taos, New Mexico, saying that a full-time opening was available on the Vaqueros Ranger District of the Carson National Forest. The pay would be $125 monthly, and if I was interested, to report forthwith. I arrived in Taos 3 days later. The Carson Forest was a large and sprawling one, located in northern New Mexico and generally near Taos. The forest headquarters. The forest supervisor was Carol Dwyer, a sort of weaselly little rascal who would not explain why he had reached outside the forest personnel and selected a kid, barely 20 years old, to take over an entire ranger district. I wondered about that, so I asked him. I had little idea what I was in for. The Vaqueros district was 150 miles removed from the rest of the forest and the forest headquarters. It set apart and was isolated by the Chiricahua Apache Indian Reservation, which lay along all the eastern boundary of the forest. To get to the ranger station, you had to debark from the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway at Dulce, the Indian Agency headquarters, and then travel 23 miles across the reservation to get into the forest district. The outgoing ranger, a lying scoundrel named Jack Turney, informed me that life on the Vaqueros was probably the most pleasant and comfortable of any places in the U.S. Forest Service, regardless of where you might go. I wanted to know if it was all that lonely, why he was leaving, and he said, "Well, the service has ordered me to Arizona. I ain't got no choice." The truth was, the Indians had sent him word they were going to kill him. He had chickened out and asked to be transferred. He met me in Dulce with a spare horse, and we rode out to the ranger station by a circuitous route, which was used to avoid the direct trail. Turney was sure the Apaches were lying in ambush for him. He didn't tell me these things, but I noticed he put me in the lead going home and let me ride his big black horse. He took his departure at break of dawn, and that was the last I ever saw of him. The ranger district was forested with pine, fir, balsam, and spruce. The country was what we called a rim rock. It had no high mountains, but was cut and slashed with a series of canyons, and atop the canyons were lofty plateaus. These are called mesas by the Mexicans, and are easy to negotiate whether afoot or horseback. The only problems were the canyons, which offered something of a barrier. The rider has to pick his way downward, and oftentimes it is so precipitous the going had to be negotiated afoot, the equine picking his way behind. There is no activity on the district, whether sawmill, logging, or not yet mining. There were a half-dozen homesteaders who were permitted to range their comparatively few head of cattle and horses on the forest acres. Off the forest and along the western and southern boundaries were a number of settlers who were privileged to graze the government land during the summer season. The northern boundary was jammed up against the Colorado state line. The ranchers who lived there had to ford the San Juan River, which pretty well precluded the use of the forest of their livestock. The country was almost 6,000 feet in elevation, and the winters were formidable ones. It dropped down to zero and sometimes stayed that way for a couple of weeks at a time. It was my job to fight such fires as might develop, but much more than that was to supervise the cowmen who ran their livestock on the federal land. I was a game warden, but the area was so remote that there were no hunters. What I had not been told, and what soon developed, was the Apaches, who were my shoulder-rubbing neighbors. The ranger station was only a quarter mile from the reservation, was the problem. These red men had 2,600 wild horses running on the district, and they made no attempt to round up these broomtails nor pay their keep. They rode out onto the district with impunity. If I jumped them out, they told me they were trying to catch a calico stud and a yellow mare colt. What they were actually doing was to cut out a fat calf, rope it, cut its throat, and butcher it and make the meat and take the meat back to agency headquarters and sell it to the Indian trader. The Mexicans who ran their little band of cows on the vaqueros were well aware of what was going on, but they were all afraid of the Apaches and did little to protect their cows. I was determined to put a stop to the rustling. Cabristo Canyon had its beginning between my district and the Indian reservation. I soon found that the Apaches entered the forest by riding up through the canyon. It was a deep, heavily timbered, and offered good cover. I took to high pointing the trail, which traversed the very bottom of this great natural cleft. There were little meadows where riders could be spotted, although briefly, as they worked their way into the vaqueros. I'd tie my horse back into pinions, snake my way forward to the very rimrock, and lie there and watch the trail below. The first week was a washout. Nary a red man showed his greasy face. The week following, 3 riders came an hour after first sun. I studied them carefully through the binoculars and noted one of them was riding a new Fraser saddle on a dun stud. The others had 2 typical Indian ponies, the first a bay and the second a gray with 4 rather strange black stockings. I knew where these were headed. I slid back off the big rock, ran for my big black horse, and put him a high trot. We angled out to the rim of the canyon at intervals, and I caught the trio every time I had a look for them. At the upper end of the Cabristo Canyon was Caracas Mesa, a huge plateau, the biggest on the Ranger District, and the ranging ground for 300 of Emmett Ritt's cow herd. This bunch of cows was under the charge of Lewis Lynch, a friend and a hell of a good hombre. What the Apaches were doing was butchering Wirt's beef and then selling it back to him. Emmett Wirt was an Indian trader, and while he was long versed in the wiles of the renegade charges, for some reason he never suspected that he was buying his own fat calves. I had talked to Lewis Lynch about this, and he knew he was losing calves, but he told me the Indians think too much of Wirt to steal his beef. I wondered about that at the time. I figured I was about to get the deadwood on them. The riders climbed up out of the very head of the canyon and passed from sight in the Caracas. I put my horse up through the pinions and, following the trail very well indeed, rode parallel to it for a half mile. The grass was good on the mesa, and I was sure the rustlers would shortly find a bunch of cows with their big calves. I tied my horse, pulling the old Winchester Model 95. It was a 30-40 out of the leather. I moved forward boldly and none too quietly. I came to quite a panorama. One of the braves had roped a big 10-month-old bull calf, and the other Indian had neatly back-footed the calf, thus stretching the hapless animal on its side. The third cow thief was just in the act of cutting the little bull's throat as I walked up within 50 yards of the scene. I shot the dun horse through the neck, and he fell dead, pinning his rider. I whipped the lever up and down and shot the bay at the junction of the head and neck. He fell so dead all 4 feet just seemed to be jerked from under him. This Apache was thrown clear. The third red man was standing over the dying calf, the bloody knife still in his hand. I shot his horse squarely in the brisket as it stood facing me. I was quite plainly in view, and all 3 Apaches stared at me. One started slowly to lift his hands above his head. I made no move to shoot again, nor come forward. The 2 went over and helped the third, whose leg was pinned under the dun stud, to get free. While they were busy at this chore, I moved off. Not far, however, maybe 50 feet, and took up a position with my back to a big pine. I knew full well these rustlers were all armed. I expected them to come after me. I waited 30 minutes, and neither saw nor heard them. I moved off and gathered up my horse and rode on towards the ranger station. Lewis Lynch was a solid one. He had been a deputy sheriff in eastern New Mexico, and had ridden in the posse that had captured the train robbers Jack Ketchum. He had married a Mexican, and his kids, 2 boys and a girl, were mestizos, but good kids for all that. "Catch up a horse and come ride with me," I told Lynch when I got down off my big black, "and fetch along your rifle." I told him what I had done, and he whistled softly. "Maybe a killin' or 2 over this, and he vouchsafed. I nodded. Fred, the older son, was my age, and Jim was 2 years younger. Everybody saddled up. Old Lynch was addicted to the 44-40. He packed it at his hip and always kept the Model 92 carbine in his saddle scabbard. He crammed the carbine in his scabbard, and the boys caught their 44s as well, and we set off for Caracas Mesa at a fast trot. It was still early morning, and as we rode, we got back to the mesa before high noon. I didn't say a word, but motioned the riders to get down and tie. We all walked up to the calf killing scene, everybody with his rifle at high port. The Apaches had gathered up their saddles and left the dead calf lying where it had been when I shot their horses. The dead animals lay just as they had fallen. Lynch never said a word. He just hobbled back to his horse, swung aboard, and took after 3 rustlers at a high trot. We rode hard for not more than 2 hours and caught the trio under a clump of pinyon pine. All 3 were armed, but none of them made a move to go for their guns. He shot out his throw rope and rode up and dropped the loop over the nearest buck's head. The Apache's eyes rolled up in his head. He thought he was going to be hanged. Lynch grunted at his boys in Spanish, and each of them shook out his rope and dropped it over an Indian's head. I was pretty keen to see what the old cowboy was going to do myself. If he was going to hang them, I was all for it. He said in Spanish, "Pues ana del cabrones." He motioned down the canyon. We set off in a single file, the Lynch trio, each with an Indian in tow. I fetched up the rear of the little cavalcade, highly pleased with the proceedings. It was 18 miles to the agency headquarters, and I could see that was where Lynch was headed. We got there about sundown, and Lynch turned his rustlers over to the Indian police and told them Emmett Wirt would prefer charges. When we went to find Wirt, this old character was a tough cookie. He had killed a man in Alamogordo and another in Carrizio, and everybody was pretty much afraid of him, even the Apaches. When Lynch told him he had 3 braves caught red-handed with a butchered calf with his brand on it, I thought for a minute he was going to swing over to the agency jail and shoot the trio out of hand. When he finally cooled off, he asked Lynch to ride up the next day and peel the hide off the big calf because you'd need that for evidence, and butcher the veal out, and you and that ranger can eat it, he sputtered. I made a friend out of one of the most powerful people in the country, and had enjoyed doing it. The Indians passed word along to me that they would kill me, and I thought maybe they would. I rode pretty light-footed for quite a while after that, but all they ever did was set my barn on fire. It was built of sawed lumber, and it made a merry blaze, but the ranger station house itself was adobe and wouldn't burn. I had a pack of hounds, which I had gathered to run lions. Because of the big population of wild horses on my ranger district and the reservation, there was a burgeoning gaggle of mountain lions. I ran the great cats with my potlickers, and it was the best of sport. To feed my lion pack, I killed an Indian horse every week. I'd ride up Vaqueros Canyon about a half mile off the station. I'd fall off my horse, whip up the old Model 92, and bowl over one of the worthless, runty little ponies. Then I'd ride back to the ranger station and turn out the dogs. They got to know exactly the score, and when I'd open the kennel door, they'd come boiling out and head up the canyon, bawling like they were on a hot lion spoor. When we'd get to the hapless equine, I'd get down and open up its belly. The dogs would lie there on the bait for a couple of days. Each hound would eat until his sides bulged, then go aside and defecate the mighty pile, and thereafter go off and sleep for a couple hours. Then he'd return to the carcass, and the cycle would be repeated. This was fine for the perros, but it didn't set very well with my dark-skinned neighbors. During the summer grazing season, I'd ride about 300 miles monthly. I was constantly in the saddle, checking brands, counting stock, looking at water holes, and forever on the lookout for fires. One late evening, I rode into the ranger station, having camped the night before at Las Norias, which was 20 miles to the south and virtually on my farthermost boundary. I had a mule and on this jackass I packed a light camping outfit. I let myself in the back gate to my horse pasture and rode across the flat meadow before the adobe 2-room structure that was my abode. I got down at the corral about the moment the place fairly spewed Indians. 3 came from around the barn, and another 5 walked out the corner of the house. Only 3 of them had guns, but they were pointed at me. It was a ticklish moment, I'll tell you. I was armed. I was always packing the Parker 45, and the old Model 95 30-40 was still in the saddle scabbard. These Apaches had me. I made no move toward either gun. They converged, and in the dusk lined up in front of me. My back was to the corral fence, and there was no way to run, even had I considered it, which I did not. You shoot 'em Indian horse. It was a sub-chief. Shit him a walking like a horse who spoke. Now we gonna kill you. I debated whether to haul out the old 45 and shoot it out with them on these words. About that time, rocks began to roll off the slope behind my barn, and it was plain from the sound that riders were coming in. The Indians turned their heads to watch the corner of the barn. I debated whether to start shooting on the diversion, but I held my fire. Lynch rode up, his 44-40 over the fork of his saddle. With him were the boys, and they had their rifles in both hands. They came on until they were hard against the pass of the red men. "What the hell is going on here?" he asked in a loud voice. The Indians all looked at the trio and gave me the chance I wanted, and I whipped over to my horse, still saddled, and jerked free the Model 95 rifle. I covered old Shit'em walking like a horse and waited to see what the braves would do. I was anxious to kill the sub-chief, who was a notorious troublemaker, but we were only a half-mile off the Indian reservation and would have the whole tribe down on us if we'd knocked off an Apache or two. "This paleface kill 'em Indian horse," old Shit'em expostulated, looking up at Lynch, who had never stepped down off his horse. "So what, you Indian bastard?" Lynch shouted at him. "I shot your goddamn horses all the time. What are you going to do about that?" The Indians milled around for a moment, and finally, their rifles carefully lowered, slunk off to their ponies, which they had tied in the rocks above the ranger station. "Come on in, Lynch," I said to my neighbor. "I can't remember when I've been happier to see you." Old Lynch, who was a real hard case, just grunted. Later on, it was mid-July, I was down on the Laguna Seco, and night caught me 14 miles from the ranger station. I knew there was a herder's tent in the next Canoncita, so I rode up there, pulled the saddle off the big black, and off-saddled the mule. I hobbled both the livestock and turned them loose. I knew full well in the morn the duo would not be more than a half-mile from camp, and having belled the big gelding, I'd hear the sound. I built a little fire and contemplated my larder. I'd been out too long, and all I had to eat was a can of green beans and a can of corn. I debated whether to eat the corn for supper and keep the beans for breakfast, or vice versa. It was a monumentous decision, let me tell you. The next morning I awoke an hour before the dawn, stoked up the fire, and put the last of my rations on to warm. Then I walked out of camp a pistol shot and listened for the bell around the neck of the gelding. No sound, however welcome it might have been, smote my ear. I thought that a bit odd, but was not too concerned. He was probably standing dozing, I speculated to myself. I walked up the canyon in the direction of the ranger station, which, as I have already noted, was 14 miles, and very directly picked up the tracks of my remuda. I noted both were hobbled, but instead of straying off the trail to feed, the big black kept right up the sendero. He's thirsty, I told myself, and is making for the Laguna Seca. The Laguna Seca was a tiny little lake nestling in a beautiful setting of giant pines. The area about it is lush with grama grass. I had watered the horses and the mule the afternoon before, but it was a long time before drinks, I realized. I kept on the trail, and in a couple of miles I found a most startling complication to my search. In the trail were the busted rope hobbles which had graced the front feet of the black horse. Upon seeing this evidence that my mount was now loose, I knew full well where he would wind up, at the back of the horse pasture at the gate hard by the ranger station. The mule, I noted by the track, still had his hobbles. Horses accustomed to hobbles learn to lift both front feet at a time, and this fashion can break into a gallop quite successfully. I did not know how fast the black was traveling, but I had faint hope the mule would ever drop out. He'd keep going to remain with his mate. I detoured briefly to lie in wait a couple hours at the Laguna Seco in the hope that the pair would swing aside and water there, but they did not. The black horse, his name was Nigger, pushed right on for the home corral. When I got within sight of my black back fence, there stood the horse and the mule. The jackass still had his rope hobbles on, and these had burned all the hair and most of the hide off his lower legs. The black galloped up to the gate and moved inside very quietly. It was the longest march I'd ever made in a pair of high-heeled boots, without breakfast yet. The next morning, riding bareback with only a halter around the horse, I caught up with the mule and went back the 14 miles, gathered up my outfit, and turned around and made the ranger station by 3 of the afternoon. Altogether, I'd done 42 miles because of a pair of busted hobbles. Some ranger before my time had set quotas for all the little ranchers who lived about the periphery of the ranger district. These cowmen could graze from a dozen to as many as 150 head of stock on the forest during the summer season. There were 4 entry ports, and I set up a schedule so that I was at each port to count the stock into the forest. Most of the ranchers had more cows than their quota called for, and the usual practice was to carefully count on the vacas they had while the ranger was doing the tally, and next day move up the extra animals they held by cousin Emilio just off the government land and put them through the gate. I was quite well aware of the typical Mexican tactic, and I was forever counting brands and livestock. When I got a case against a ranchero, I simply canceled his quota and rode over to his little jackal and told him all to get all his goddamn cows off the forest. This was not exactly the way to make friends and favorably influence people, but it sure gave the Mexicans who hadn't been caught pause to consider. One of my worst violators was a young campesino named Fidel Jimenez. He had a permit for 60 cows, and I tallied these animals onto the forest through the compost gate. The next day, I rode back into Compost Canyon and counted 87 cows with the Jimenez brand on them. I rode over to see Fidel and told him to gather up all his goddamn cows and get the lot off the forest. He got pretty mad about that. "I no have 86 cows on the forest," he was screaming at me. "Get your vacas off and do it tomorrow," I told him. "And I'll be at the Campos gate to see you get 'em off," I instructed. The next morning, I was at the gate, and Jimenez came storming up from his shack, which was about 5 miles off the forest. He had 6 riders with him, all cousins. It was a dangerous situation, but I couldn't see any guns being packed by the gaggle of Paisianos. Jimenez rode up to me and said, "If you have no pistol, I whip you." I got down off Nig, unbuckled the gun belt, and let the Parker 45 fall on the ground. "Just try it, you Mexican son of a bitch," I told him. He did not get off his horse, but kept maneuvering around to get between me and the pistol on the ground. I could see his game, and I circled with him, meanwhile calling him all the names in Americanese and Mexican I could think of. Finally, aware that he was not going to get between me and my shooting iron, he rode off with the warning, "I gonna kill you." I rode off for the ranger station with my eye cocked back over my shoulder, I'll tell you.